Um, Hi everyone, and welcome to this morning's open access session on open educational resources. You don't have to create a textbook, kindly presented by Anthony O'Brien and Ruth Cameron. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today's session will be recorded and it will be shared after the event. So if you could please keep your microphones muted and cameras off unless you're speaking. And if you have any questions along the way, just pop them into the chat and we'll answer them as we go. And before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands within our footprint areas, the Awabakal, Darkinjung, Biripi, Wulmai, Wulnara and Eora nations. We also pay respect to the wisdom of the elders past, present and emerging. And I would like to extend this acknowledgement and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people here today. So with that, I will hand over to Anthony and Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So yes, Ruth and I are alternating presenting today. So when one of us is presenting, the other will be moderating. So as Angela noted, any questions, please pop them in the chat and we will pause as we go through, just so that we can kind of keep the questions in line with what we're showing them. So yes, hello, my name is Anthony. I'm the copyright advisor here at the university. So I'm going to look at some licensing and usage considerations. So that's a really big thing with OER and open materials. And Ruth is going to look more at the finding and using side of things for, okay, what can we actually do with it now? So before we get too far in though, let's actually talk about what they are. So open education resources, or commonly known as OER. When you think about materials and copyright and stuff like that, people think, okay, so someone's written something, they're sharing it online, it's copyrighted, I can't really do that much with it. So open education resources are basically meant to be materials for teaching and learning that, instead of being locked behind that all rights reserved copyright that normally happens, they're usually licensed within that copyright so that they give you permissions and you can take them, you can use them, you can adapt them. So they do this through open licensing, and I'll definitely be looking at that as part of the session. And they're a really good way for educators who perhaps don't have a lot of funding behind them, or they might have some other restrictions, to actually improve their pedagogical practice, to do more with limited budgets, or perhaps even limited tools that they might have available. So they're taking materials that somebody else has made and they're kind of able to use them because of that licensing. So we're obviously big fans of them, which is why we're presenting this session today. But yeah, I'll keep going, I guess. So as for why they're important, I kind of touched on this a little bit already. It's all about sharing what you make. So if you've put together an educational tool or resource and you think it's great and you want to get it out there in the world, doing it as an OER is a good way of doing it. Like I said, it's about sharing what you've made with other people that might not have the same budgets or tools available. As far as costs go, for students, they're a really good option, simply because rather than having to fork out, say, $300 for a textbook that might only get used, for the semester, and then kind of they move on to something else and they're like, so what do I do with this now? OERs, basically free or very limited cost as far as something like printing or that might go. It's a really good way of kind of getting those resources for the students and not have to kind of fork out money for them. For creators, the control of how the resources are used or licensed is a really big selling point. So as I mentioned, standard copyright is all rights reserved. It means once it's shared, if people wanted to do something with it, they would have to contact you and get permission. By use of these open licensing, you can actually choose, or the creators can choose, what is it that I want to allow people to do? And again, I will look at the types of licensing a little bit later. So these permissions are kind of baked in to the resource, and it means that people don't have to guess or think, oh God, am I allowed to do this? Because they can see straight away from the license. Can I do this with it? Yes. Can I do this with it? Yes. Can I do this with it? And that kind of goes into the fourth point that I have on the screen here, adaptability. So there are lots of times where resources might only be made available in English. And if they're locked under all rights reserved copyright, that's basically it. They're in English, they're going to stay in English. OER allow creators all over the world to take that material, to translate it, to adapt it for local sensibilities or cultural specificities, build, mash it together, do lots of different things. So that adaptability and flexibility in these resources is one of the big reasons why they are so important, because people can take it and do what they need with them to suit their own needs and students or clients. Just before we go too much further, any questions so far?
There's nothing in the chat so far, Anthony.
Good. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll get to them. So this is a table that I've reproduced from a slide called OER Enabled Pedagogy. And it's basically spelling out the types of resources that people might come across, the kind of cost that would have to either an educator or a student, and then the permissions that are around that. So standard textbooks, again, one of those, say, $300 types, expensive to students and to educators, and the permissions for reuse or adapting are really restrictive because of that all rights reserved. So you may come across, so-called free resources on the web. So lots of free documents and stuff like that, those massive online open courses or MOOCs, and even things like library resources that the library pays for but are free for the end user. Even those tend to be quite restrictive, again, because in most cases, they're that all rights reserved copyright. And then we get to our open education resources. So they're basically free, great. And this is proper free, not free in inverted commas. And the permissions are usually much more open around them. And they're referred to as the 5 Rs, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But you can see here, obviously, for usage, for cost, open education resources are the way to go. So I'm going to talk a lot about OER here, but you'll see there in the heading, I've got true OER. So there are lots and lots of open materials that you'll find on the web. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, there's lots of free stuff. And people think, oh, it's on the web, I can download it, it's free, therefore I can do what I want with it, right? Sorry, not actually the case. Even stuff that is free to download on the web usually is copyrighted to somebody, and it's quite limited what you can do with it. True OER, as opposed to other open access materials, have the ability to do what we call the 5 Rs. So they give users the permission to engage with the activities that are listed on here, and anything that basically ticks off all 5 of these can actually be called a true OER. So the first one here, retain. So this is a fairly standard one. So you can download it, make copies, and basically just store and manage it. So that's kind of baked into the permissions. That's pretty standard with most resources that you get. So moving along the line there, we've got number 2 is reuse. So this is the ability to use the content in lots of different ways. And people don't often think about this with teaching. So there are different levels of permissions with resources depending, are you using it in a face-to-face class? Are you using it in an online class that's being streamed via something like Zoom? Are you putting it into a web page or into a YouTube video or something like that? So there are all these different kind of layers or levels, and a true OER will give you the ability to do all of them as under that reuse. So the next one along, just keeping this chugging along, is revise. So this is the ability to adapt, modify, or alter the content, including translation. So taking it and making it kind of suitable for your local usage or your client base, your students, whatever. And this is actually something that isn't available in a lot of resources. So a lot of the things that are just open on the web, you can't actually do number 3 with. You need to find something that's specifically licensed that allows you to do this. So again, this is a big one to look out for. Can I actually make changes to the content? And yeah, if so, usually a good sign of an OER. So this next one here, remix, and you might think, what's the difference between this and this? So remixing is about taking another work and kind of mashing it together with something else. So say, for example, we've got a textbook that we've found as an OER, and it might just simply reproduce, say, 4 or 5 different chapters, but they're kind of all still separate. That's not a remix, that's actually just called a collection. So it's actually just a different type of reuse where the same material is being reproduced as is, it's just being kind of collated together. An actual remix is where you might take it and say, for example, you might see some content from an open, an appropriately licensed journal article that you like, and you might take some of that out, and then you might get some nice pictures out of a website, again, appropriately licensed, take those out, and then you might get something else from a, say, an electronic book that you like. And I've run out of hands here, obviously, but take those out, and then you kind of mix that content together to make new content. That is a remix. So you're combining different things, you're revising different things, and you're essentially creating something new, not just collecting together stuff that already exists. And then number 5 is also very, very important. It's the ability to redistribute. So it's basically permission to share either the original version, any new versions you've made, any remixes you've made. It's kind of giving you the license to then share that on with the rest of the world. So those 5 things there are essentially what makes a true OER: retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. People love their alliterations, and you'll see that Ruth has a slide with that as well. So Ruth is going to talk a little bit later about the types of OER and things like that. So you'll see that in her section of the presentation.
Anthony, we've just had a really pertinent question in chat. Is there a requirement that the original source/author be recognised though?
Funnily enough, this is what we're going to talk about right now. So very good question. So thank you to whoever submitted that. You're definitely thinking along the right lines. So I've mentioned licensing quite a few times already. So these are some of the key things that you will see on a true open education resource. So something that meets those 5 R's. So there are 3 things that pop up a lot. This attribution, also known as BY, is basically going to be on everything. I might as well talk about that because that answers the question. So whenever you are taking somebody else's materials and reusing them, especially things that have a Creative Commons license on them, this attribution is important. You always need to give that appropriate credit. So what that means in reality is that you give the details of the creator, usually the title of the resource and a link to it, and then the license that it's shared under as well. We want people to understand what the materials are licensed under so that there's no confusion down the track. A lot of OERs change hands multiple times. So somebody might create something in the US, it then might get adapted by somebody in the UK that changes it for their local audience. And then it might get, say, translated into Japanese, and from Japanese, somebody might find it gets translated into French. So that kind of chain of custody almost is where that attribution is important. So we know who created the original, what changes have been made, and that way it can kind of be tracked back if people need to. So it's basically the same way that lecturers would expect students to reference their assignments. This is the same kind of idea. It's just that little bit more information because there's a need to provide the license too. So this is something that will always come into play. Credit is important. And that's something that if you are creating your own as well, you can feel safe in the knowledge that anything you've created, you will always get that credit for it. So these other 2 are interesting things that you may come across. Non-commercial. And this is something that quite often people contact me as copyright advisor and they ask about. It's like, oh, but the university is a commercial entity, so I can't use this, can I? So it basically comes down to the use, not the user, if that makes sense. So even though the university, yes, is a commercial entity, what we're actually doing is educational. So that use is okay under this form of license. So if ever you see this, don't panic, just think, okay, it just means we can't make money from it. Easy. So again, you can pretty much, I was going to say you could ignore it, but that's not actually true. So you can ignore the fact that it's non-commercial because what our use is educational. Ta-da. Now, the third one on here that you will see on some licensing that you find for OERs is called share alike. And this is quite often misunderstood because it's like, oh, that just means I can share it. It actually means that you need to retain the license that's attached. And I have some sample licenses coming up, so we can talk about those. So any adaptations or changes, translations, whatever that you make, you have to share under either the same license, or the most recent version of this also talks about compatible licenses. So interestingly enough, there are no other Creative Commons compatible licenses for this. So basically it's share alike, but there are some compatible image licenses, software licenses, that type of thing. And if ever anyone has questions around this, please contact me. I can help you decipher the language terms. Even though a lot of the licenses do use, I guess, simplified or plain language on top of their legal speak, sometimes it still is a little bit confusing about, oh, does my use actually kind of meet this? I'm not sure. So please contact me if you're not sure about that, and I do have that on my slides. So these are the big three that you'll see in the licensing for true OER. So we're going to duck back into the licensing thing in a sec, but one of the things that people often ask about as well is this OA, or open access materials, and their relationship with open education resources. So I'm just going to give a plug to our digital institutional repository that we have here. It's called Nova. We have lots of open access materials in there. We have digital theses, we have journal articles, book chapters, entire books. There's all kinds of things up there. And those are all open access where we can make them. So one of the things, and basically all three headings on here come down to similar things. It's all about the licensing, that all the permissions that are attached to these resources. So open access materials, they may be able to be used in OER. So I talked about the compilation aspect earlier, where we had different chapters or articles that we kind of just collected 4 or 5 of them together and made a nice little textbook. Ta-da. So if we can find something that has an appropriate license, we can just collect them together, ta-da, done. So we could actually collect these open access materials and make an OER out of them. And then there are other times that you get the license on there and it ticks off those 5 R's that we talked about earlier. And those ones you could actually adapt and make into an OER in and of themselves. But again, it's important to have a look at the licensing on it. So say, for example, some of the journal articles that are up in Nova, we might have an author manuscript version, and it might be from a certain publisher, and they have required we put a certain license on it to make it openly available to the public. And that license might say, you know, no, you can't do any adaptation. So that you couldn't take and change into an OER, but you might be able to reproduce within an OER. And I know that doesn't sound that, it's like, but yeah, it's one of those things that the licensing will tell you what you need to do. And that's basically what what the last point there is saying. Not all open is the same. So the 3 things that usually will get held back with some open access materials are the conditions under revise, remix, and some of the reuse. So again, have a look at the licensing or contact me if you're not sure. Before I move on to the next bit, any other questions?
No questions in chat so far.
Good, good. Okay. So while we are talking about licensing, and again, a lot of my talk is licensing because that's basically what copyright's around. So there are other things that you will come across as part of your journey around open access and open education resources. So one thing you should not see on a true OER is this, no derivatives, also known as ND. This basically means you can't make any changes, you can't really do much to it at all. But this one here, actually, it's interesting. It's usually called a sharing only license. So again, going back to that idea of I'm just collecting some journal articles or book chapters together to make a new book. You could actually do that with something with a no derivatives license because you are just reproducing it as is. You just are putting some other material around it as well. And that's perfectly fine. So you can't change it though. It must be produced exactly as is. There are a few kind of small changes you can make, and I mean like minute. You can do things like if there are typos, you're allowed to fix them. If you've got something American and you need to tweak the spelling for your audience, that is something that you can technically do within no derivatives, but that's literally the limit of it. You can't, take out content and replace it with other content. You can make small kind of spelling or typo changes, and that's it. So no adaptation and no translation. On the more positive side of things, we have public domain. Yay, I like these. I always like talking about public domain, partly because it goes back to that idea I talked about earlier, that a lot of people think that just because it's on the web and you can download it for free, oh, it's publicly available, therefore it's public domain. Not actually true. True public domain means something is essentially free to use and do whatever you want with. You don't have to think about copyright because it is out of copyright. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. Sometimes it's because of age. There are things that just, they hit that limit within the legislation. And here in Australia, it's usually 70 years after the death of the author that it kind of drops off. But there are other reasons why things are out of copyright. It might not have been original enough to start with. Its formal function may have meant that it wasn't able to be copyrighted. There are lots of reasons. Some countries, you need to actually renew your copyright, and if you don't do that, therefore the copyright falls off. So there are about 6 of them altogether, and it's a boring story. You don't need to hear all of them, but just be aware that if you see that PD, or sometimes it's PDM, that's known as the public domain mark. And that's something that somebody has identified as being in the public domain and kind of put that mark on it. So you'll see a lot of this stuff in Wikimedia Commons, for example, with images that people will have sourced materials and identified that it's in public domain. The other time that public domain comes up is this CC0, which is the second option here. So this is where the creators have gone, I really don't want my copyright on this. I want this to be shared freely and people to do whatever they want with it. So they're, as the language says, they're actually dedicating it to the public domain and they're throwing it out there. So CC0, even though it does have the Creative Commons bit in it, it's not technically a license the way the other things are that we've talked about. It's known as a public domain tool. But there are some countries where the public domain doesn't technically exist. So in those countries, CC0 does actually work like a license. There's essentially a level built into it that kind of backs it up and gives it that legal standing for those countries where there is technically no public domain. So essentially people can still do what the creator intended. So this is something to think about. If you really don't care about your ownership of something and you do want to make something, you can throw it out into CC0. And then of course there's our old friend there, all rights reserved, standard copyright. So just because it has this on it doesn't mean that you can't use it. So I'm sure people have probably heard me do sessions around standard copyright and how our educational use here at the university is covered within the Copyright Act. It's not covered by, if you want to go ahead and make an OER and adapt something, it's not covered for the same thing. So for example, the massive online open courses or MOOCs, they don't get to rely on the same thing that a closed course that only our university students get to do. So in this case, if you find something, say there's a really great pictograph on the web that you find, and it's copyrighted to a certain organization, you can reach out to them and you can say, hi, I'm putting together a resource. I'm planning on putting some open licensing on it. Would you mind if I reproduced your content in there? And I'll give you full credit and make sure it's clear that you own the copyright. So you can actually reach out and get that permission. It just because it's all right reserved doesn't mean you can't put it in there, but be aware that a lot of people will say no. But still, it doesn't hurt to ask.
Anthony, we've had another question.
Yes.
It's from the same person who asked the first question, Annika. Can you combine chapters from various textbooks with your own chapters into a textbook for a course?
Theoretically, yes, depending on the licensing. Currently at the university, we have our IP policy needs a little bit of updating to move in line with OER, and that's something that I'm looking into at the moment. So it is possible to do, but again, it comes down to the licensing. So you could license it so that you own the material you created, but you'd be reliant on whatever is attached to the others. So say, for example, we get a chapter from a commercial publisher, and we tried to put that into ours, that would not be something we could do with an OER unless we got explicit permission from the publisher to do so. If you were doing it for internal university use only, we may be able to rely on other things within the Copyright Act, but that's probably more a conversation for offline rather than right now. But good question, thank you. So I'm just going to, just because I realize we're getting up there in time and I want to make sure Ruth has got time to get through her stuff, just going to talk about these couple of sample open licenses I've got on here. So there's 3 of them. So the first one here, CC BY, this is the Creative Commons Attributions license. It's very, very flexible. It allows people to do pretty much anything they want with it, but they have to give the credit to the original creator, the work and the licensing. So if you are seeing this out and about, you can feel safe knowing that this is something that you can take and change very easily. The second one is the CC BY SA, and as you'll remember from the slide, this means it's attribution share alike. So it's basically similar to the previous one, but it also has that additional element of share alike. So we need to follow that licensing and make sure anything that we create out of it is actually shared under the same license. And then we have our last friend here. So usually the more elements get added, the more restrictive they are. So this is the CC BY NC ND, or attribution non-commercial, no derivatives. So if ever you see this on something that's calling itself an OER, it's not actually an OER because it doesn't allow for that revise, remix, and some of the reuse is gone as well. So it's the least flexible Creative Commons license. And as I mentioned before, it's sharing only. But one of the things I do get asked about is, say, for example, you find a nice report that somebody's put out and it's got this license on it. You can actually take the images, say, out of that report and reproduce them as is. So you can take elements and reproduce them. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. You just can't make changes to whatever you take out of it. And again, that's a conversation we can have in more depth if you are interested. Oh, good. So I'm basically hitting the half-hour mark, and that's perfect. So any other questions that people have? If you think of things after the session, anything around open licensing, license compatibility, whether you can put things together, even if you want some tips and tricks for, how can I seek permission to get the reuse that I need, please reach out. My details are on the screen there. So I'm copyright, RIGHT, at newcastle.edu.au, and my internal phone number is 16456. So yes, please reach out if you need it. And we're going to swap over now. I'm going to hand it over to Ruth, and she's going to talk about finding and using OER. So I'm going to stop sharing so that, let me stop, there it is.
Thanks, Anthony. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so can we see finding and using OER? Awesome, thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody to finding and using OER, otherwise known as You Don't Have to Write a Textbook, Getting Creative in the Commons. My name is Ruth Cameron. I'm the coordinator of Digital Library Programs. This unit coordinates the creation of digital learning objects to support students' information literacy skills. So today I'll cover the different types of open educational resources, how to discover them, how to engage with them in terms of evaluation, how to practice or use them, and where to from here for the University of Newcastle. Okay, so if you've heard of OER, you might feel a bit panicky about the idea of creating a digital textbook from scratch, or even reading through it for evaluation purposes. Okay, and that fits into the big image on the screen at the moment. But don't worry, OER can take many forms, from digital learning objects like infographics, videos, and quizzes, and they fit into the small section on the screen, moving up to book chapters, guides, and leaflets, which we can call in between. And that's before you even get into the textbook arena. So I'll talk about evaluating OER in a few moments, but first, how do you find them? You might feel daunted by the number of places to look for OER, as they tend to be created and stored on many different platforms. 3 platforms you might like to investigate to start with are textbook repositories, OER Commons, and the upcoming Canvas Commons. So as Anthony mentioned, the Creative Commons licensing means that you can reuse content from these platforms, which is suitably attributed. Now, with textbook repositories, if you're looking for Australian content, Australian universities are creating their own textbook repositories, such as La Trobe's eBureau, RMIT's Open Textbook Initiative, and USQ's textbook repository using Pressbooks. Members of the Open Educational Practice Special Interest Group aspire to an eventual Australian or Australasian repository of OER, which could be accessed by member institutions. But until that happens, in the meantime, we also have platforms such as the Open Textbook Library, Pressbooks Directory, and the Open Education Network. And all of those are US based. I'll just show you the Open Textbook Library. Here we are. Okay, so you can see it's got your search the library bar right at the top. You can also browse by subjects, and you can see we've got heaps and heaps of subjects to search through. You can see that at the moment they have 952 open textbooks. Sorry about that. I'm a bit clunky with my Zoom presentation. Okay, so talking about OER Commons, this is a website that contains textbooks together with smaller OER, such as assessments, diagrams and illustrations, full courses, lesson plans, and so on. And staff from academic libraries in Australia and New Zealand are already uploading information literacy resources that they want to share. You can find their contributions in the Digital Dexterity Educators group. OER Commons has a detailed sharing policy, which means the authors have control over whether you can share them with or without changes. So I'll just show you that website as well. Okay, and it's just, the website is just oercommons.org. And you can find the Digital Dexterity Educators group under groups here at the top of the screen. But yes, you can see here, you can type in natural language to search on keywords. You can, again, browse by subject. You can look at the education level. It goes right through from preschool up to graduate and professional, which counts as university education, and adult education, which also includes vocational training. You can also search by educational standard. Now, of course, because this is a US site, most of them are American. So I'm not sure that we actually have any Australian educational standards in there at this time. But hopefully, as more Australians become aware of this website, that will change. And Anthony, do we have any questions in chat?
We just had a question whether or not we could make the slides available. So I've suggested that yes, we could.
That sounds like a good suggestion. Okay, and Canvas Commons. So our own Canvas Commons will go live in a few weeks, and you'll be able to find and reuse shared content from University of Newcastle staff. The library and academic learning support, to name just 2 university units, are creating Canvas Commons resources which you'll be able to lift straight into your courses. When Canvas goes live, you'll be able to find Canvas Commons by navigating to the bottom of the left-hand menu and clicking Commons, and then you can search for content. Library and academic learning support modules will give students access to up-to-date resources to support them with specific learning activities. And we're also planning a successful study online set of resources to support students who are studying off campus. If you have questions about how and when to use Canvas Commons, please contact the team at uonline@newcastle.edu.au. And please also follow the SharePoint site displayed on the screen to keep up to date with progress and changes in that space. So here's an example of the student view of a library information literacy module. This one was created by Susan Zhang from the library. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the list of contents in that module, and you'll see from the icons that at the moment they are all pages, but you will also be able to create and use different elements such as quizzes, infographics, videos, and things like that. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see one of these pages. This is the learning outcomes page, and you can see that you can also include links out there to different resources. And those are created by the library. Again, go library. Okay, so once you've found a resource that you think will be useful, how do you evaluate it? So the first and most important evaluation method is this: understand your course and student requirements. And then you might find several OER that fit different requirements, and that's okay. As Anthony said, the beauty of OER is that you often have the option to mix and match so that they fit your students' and courses' needs more closely. In terms of academic quality, an increasing number of OER repositories have an in-house peer review system, and most of them, including Pressbooks and the Open Monograph platform, do provide support in this area. I know I've spoken to people from USQ about the Pressbooks platform, and the support they receive from Pressbooks is phenomenal. However, if you feel that by using the content, you should be responsible for evaluating it, you can look at these aspects: subject matter for accuracy, objectivity, and completeness; style and presentation to make sure that it's appropriate for your learners' level and their learning styles; pedagogy to make sure that it fits well with the kind of assignments and assessments that you want to create; and technical aspects to make sure that you and your learners will be able to use it, and this includes accessibility. Okay, so practicing or using OER, there are really three levels. You can adopt, you can adapt, or you can author. So adopting just means that you use something as is. You will need to evaluate it, of course, to make sure that it fits your needs. Second level is adapting something which is useful, but it could be more so with a bit of tweaking, such as adding local case studies or data, or again, you might find several different OER that you can remix. And the final level is you can author something from scratch, either by yourself or in collaboration with other staff or even other institutions. So where to from here? The vision for the university in this space. The library is working with Education Innovation to promote OER. We're also participating in the Council of Australian University Librarians, or CALL, projects for OER, including the CALL Open Educational Resources Collective. This will provide infrastructure for member institutions to publish a set number of titles of their choosing each year. It will also support publication of OER in targeted disciplines through a collaborative cross-institutional authoring model, drawing on the strength of networks within the CALL membership to encourage cross-institutional collaboration. Second CALL project is a pilot OER professional development program. And the third project that we're taking part in is a plan for OER advocacy, with a view to raising the visibility of the OER agenda and related issues. That project will focus on both local and national advocacy. The project team will deliver a toolkit for member institutions to use for local advocacy, and it will also plan and undertake advocacy at a national level, focusing on DVC's academic and the government. In the meantime, you can use OER Commons and the textbook repositories mentioned in this presentation. You have the upcoming Canvas Commons resources, and the library is writing a guide to OER. So as you can see, you don't have to write a textbook to incorporate OER into your teaching. You don't even have to use a whole book. There are lots of options available. So if you do think of questions after this presentation, please contact Lisa Ogle from the University Library, and you can see her contact details there on the screen. Anthony, did we have any more questions in chat?
No further questions, but we have had a couple of links posted by some of the other staff in the session. So the copyright support at the library has been posted there. and also the link to our other open access events.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, this slide is here. Anthony advised me that for licensing reasons, I need to show it to you. You know, just following through on that whole attribution and recognition. Thank you very much for listening, and I will hand you back to Angela.
Thanks, Ruth. So thank you very much, Anthony and Ruth. That was really interesting and informative. We do have some more open access events. They're on the library's website. I've just popped that into the chat, as Anthony mentioned. But thank you very much for everyone joining today, and enjoy the rest of your day.